men struggling with emotions, intimacy, and connection? Are you struggling with a man that struggles with emotions, intimacy, and connection? If you are struggling with these concerns, this video might be just for you. Hi everyone, welcome to Menelio Psychologist. I'm Dr. Margaret Lee, licensed clinical psychologist in California. Today I'm inviting my colleague Dr. Leif Griffin to talk about men's mental health and also what are some of the challenges faced by men when they're considering seeking psychotherapy. Hi Leif, thanks for being on the show today.
Thank you so much, Margaret, for having me on the show. My name is Leif. I am a clinical psychologist, so Dr. Leif Griffin. Introducing myself, I'll just say that I'm originally from Minnesota in the United States, and I went to graduate school in Berkeley at the Wright Institute. I am an early career psychologist, but I've had various training experiences, and now I'm in the field. My license, something that I've really wanted to sort of sink my teeth into and talking to you today about men's issues. Obviously, I think that having this chance to talk about men's issues, it's a very large, sort of undertaking, but one thing is really just that kind of hesitation, and I think that there can be a lot of shame that that men experience when they think about therapy. And I wanted to know, does that connect with you at all when you kind of think about your experiences?
Yeah, definitely. Sometimes it's as seen as the last resort, like nothing worse. That's why they're here. That their wife is threatening to divorce them, their parents threatening to kick them out, or putting kind of like an ultimatum.
And it makes me think about also in America in particular, and this is where obviously where I'm locating my own sort of like my own origin and my own sort of growing up. But I think that there is, not just for men but also for women, there can be a sense of therapy is for if things are so bad that like you said, that nothing else is going to work, and I think that there's a lot of shame in that sort of in that feeling.
What I encounter a lot is men that turn to substance abuse or other addiction, video gaming, drinking with their buddies. They try everything.
Right.
As if those methods are better than therapy, right? Which is really sad, but then in their world kind of makes sense. So can you help me make sense of this as a man, I guess, speaking?
Yeah, let's try. I think I'm really excited to talk about this. And so one thing that I want to talk about, Margaret, to first just kind of ground, myself and maybe give a little bit of a grounding to sort of this, short exploration, is the way in which masculinity, in particular in the U.S., I'm using that as a very broad term, but in the U.S. culture, how masculinity really sort of impacts the ways that that all men really tend to think about themselves and also think about different aspects in their life, such as seeking therapy, and such as even getting help. And so that's kind of something I want to talk about, is that that there's really this dominant sort of view that even if we don't believe that it's true, or that it is kind of like a fair assessment of what it means to be a man, it's out there, and it's something that impacts men of all identities, and I think that starting there, I just want to look at some of the, I guess, dominant assumptions that a lot of that all men are impacted by. I think that one of the ways that I think can be helpful from a psychological standpoint to think of this is that there's these dominant assumptions. And for example, one dominant assumption, and as a man growing up and as a boy, was that it's not okay to cry. And even kind of, that's sort of the extreme, but even sort of being emotional. My parents would sort of refer to me and as sensitive when I was growing up. And there was a positive in that, but there was also this shame that I ended up really taking from this attribute that that I was kind of, introduced to, and that was used to sort of describe my behavior. And what I came to realize when I was, kind of in school, and as I, just sort of in these ways that I might not be able to isolate exactly when it happened, but that was not a good thing. It was not a good thing to sort of be emotional. And I mean, even that term, emotional, I mean, and we can talk about the way that women are often, where that can be used as very much, kind of like a negative thing. But for men as well, there's this dominant assumption that to be a man, you need to be logical and rational. And that's kind of an ideal. And then on the other side, to be emotional is sort of like the bad end of things.
When you talk about men's emotion, the first word that comes to my mind is anger.
Yeah. That's a great, So tell me about that. So when you think about that, why do you think that's come to be where your mind goes to first?
It's just from working with so many boys and men of different age, right? Usually that's when they describe their problem. I have an anger issue. That is a lot more acceptable than, let's say, I'm sad about my mom. I'm angry at them, right? Like it just sounds a lot more masculine and powerful and
Right. I love that. And actually that's another, so one of the kind of, ways I'm grounding this is like this very dichotomous way of thinking about masculinity. Mm-hmm. And, on the one side, there's logical, as I kind of talked about, and then there's emotional. And then you mentioned something, how anger is much more acceptable because there's some, power. There's some sense of power. Whereas on the other side, maybe an emotion such as sadness, there's not power. It's kind of in a masculine, in this kind of overall way that masculinity is held in our culture, it's seen as weak. So powerful and weak are the two sort of dichotomies. And there's all these dichotomies that I really think tend to make up, masculinity in this kind of very dominant sense. Another big interest of mine is self-esteem and shame. I really see that, dominant ideas of like for men of all identities of what it means to be a man, when we inevitably do not meet these ideal expectations, there's really big like wounds to our self-esteem and to our sense of sort of being good enough. I think that's another thing that's really.
How do we combat that? I mean, growing up, man, woman, being evaluated since very young, right? You get the A's, B's, C's, D's. How do we move forward and tackle that?
Yeah. Well, I think one thing that's really helped me is actually, and I guess I'm thinking both as a therapist, but also, as someone who's been in therapy and as a cisgender man who, has really kind of struggled with my own, I think, sense of being good enough and really kind of comparing to this, to a lot of different standards. I think one thing that's been really helpful for me is just kind of learning that this is not just an internal or an individual problem, but that this is something that all men really struggle with, and sort of normalizing that there's these ideals that are often from the standpoint of a white male, and at least in U.S. culture, and often from a standpoint of this is how you be a successful man, and starting to sort of realize that this is like just an ideal. It's not even an ideal in a sense of it's the ideal. It's just kind of like this assumption, and it's both. It contains racism, because there's a sense that white or sort of European American standards are the ways in which a man should be, and so this obviously just on its own really has so many people, because of their cultural and racial identity, already excluded from what it means to be an ideal man. And so I think just realizing this affects everybody, including a white man, has helped me to sort of get some distance from some of these comparisons and some of these ways So awareness, I think, to sort of answer it in, a more succinct term.
Yeah. And sometimes I remind my clients that we forget the diversity in human. Diversity, not just the race, gender, ethnicity, but also this person's family background.
Right.
So my undergrad was actually in social welfare. So I learned a lot of sociology, and there's a term that's called cultural capital.
Okay, yeah.
Which is, the resource you have from your home. That's not just the financial income or the socio-economic status of your household, but how many books you have at home. Let's say if you are interested in engineer, right? Like, does your parents have friends that are engineers that you get to talk to when you were young? Like, I always give the example of Elon Musk, right? Elon Musk didn't just launch SpaceX because he's a dreamer. No, like his grandpa actually remodeled his own plane in his backyard.
Yeah.
Right? So Elon Musk came with a family history of adventures and space and exploration, which, some of our families don't get the exposure to.
Yeah, no, I think that's so important. I didn't know that about Elon Musk, but you're right. Within sort of this larger narrative, we would view him as, he would be viewed as sort of the successful man, and then we would forget all the things that have propped him up, and also the fact that he's got all this privilege.
Right. So when we're kind of evaluating ourselves to what's a good enough man or a good man.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Like there's so many different layers.
I love that. Yes. I think that, so this is something that I've really tried to start to understand, I think even less as a therapist, so that I can really embody it when I'm working with my clients. But like, there's so many ways to be a man. And also, I think even more fundamentally, like, who am I just like as like a whole person? And the parts of me that I've cut off, and I mean in terms of like that were not desirable from a masculine standpoint. So such as, I'll use the term emotional, even though I just haven't thought of a better one yet. But really, instead of having the shame, which again is kind of one of my big interests, sort of blocking that from view and sort of like in my interactions, really trying to disown that. I think that I'm really passionate about how do we, like, with my clients, with myself, really just kind of shine a light on all of these different attributes that make up me, and that are in kind of like outside of this sort of filter of what's good and what's bad, and then just really kind of acceptance along with that awareness is sort of developing an acceptance practice. And that's something that I've found has been really helpful in working with these things. Yeah.
Right. Like, how much are you living for yourself versus for society?
Yes. Exactly. How do you do that with I'm curious with all patients or clients, really helping to sort of not be living for society? I love that sort of way of thinking about it.
Yeah, so I do this exercise, which is the value sorting exercise.
Okay, yeah.
I do this with almost all of my male clients. I mean, I do this with my female clients too, but in terms of, the expectation for themselves, or, just talking about the low self-compassion, right? Like, I need to do X, Y, Z in order to feel worthy.
Yes,
right?
yes.
So this value sorting exercise really helped them see what really mattered to them. And what I like to do with them in this exercise is that after their first round, I'm like, let's look at this. How many of this are your voice versus societal voice?
Oh, wow. Wow. How does that go usually?
You need a couple rounds.
Okay.
I think for depends on the client's insight and awareness, right? Sometimes you have to challenge them a little bit more. Like, let's say if you only have a month to live. Which is another very mortal question, right?
Uh-oh.
But I think this question is really how home, ground them. Like, okay, if I really have this short amount of time, am I really gonna care about the big car, the big house, or the big body?
Right.
Versus like, maybe I'll just go hike.
Right. Yeah. Right. And Margaret, it's made me think about, for some men, it's okay if the answer to that question is, I really want that big car. And it's kind of like just having that sort of like, not having someone like you said, society standards, like really shrinking who we can be and who, like what we can care about, how we show up in our relationships.
And how are they congruent to your value?
Right.
So 101 is sort of like, okay, well, how do you balance that?
Yeah. Right. Wow. That's true. Adulting can be really hard in that way, to have to figure out what's actually what our reality is as well. And
what are some of the more common concern, I guess, for men that come in therapy for you?
A few kind of overall categories that really have come up that I've seen are, again, I've already talked about this one, but emotionality, just to kind of really highlight it, because I think it's a really important one. But again, sort of this sense of feeling cut off from one's emotions, that feelings of depression or of insecurity or of even anxiety. So very common things, not just having those issues, but then feeling this other layer of, this is weak for me having these.
I shouldn't feel this way.
I should not feel this way. Exactly. And again, that's where that realm of shame, I think, can really, kind of complicate, something that, like, all humans experience the full range of emotions, but when we have these things we shouldn't feel, then we're really at war with ourselves. And so that's a very common thing that I've seen. Another one that I think really goes along with this is self-reliance, or sort of independence, and really feeling like, coming into therapy, and as you mentioned, Margaret, feeling like I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for, my partner, or, kind of waiting till that last really, sort of straw. And I think that what I see is this feeling of, I should be able to, like, figure out everything on my own.
Yeah.
I should not have to get help, and especially for emotional issues. Yeah. So those are two really big ones.
Sometimes I tell them, welcome to the new territory. Not that it wasn't there, it's just it hasn't been discovered. Wow.
Yes. Kind of like opening the, because then there's just a huge open space, which is kind of scary, but it's also different than a wall, than a shutdown.
It's very scary, right? Like, emotion is not just like, I can pick and choose to feel happy.
Yes.
And grateful and thankful and powerful and strong, but then I just chose not to feel weak, sad, angry.
But you know what, our culture, and I mean, just like, and this is, again, just from kind of growing up in the US and in America, we sort of act as if we can control our emotions and that we should just be happy, and like, all the things that parents, as a new dad, I feel sometimes I'm really, like, I have a young daughter that I've told you about, who's 10 months. And, when she's really upset, there is the impulse to really try to kind of make her happy, and I think that you kind of grow up knowing that, like, oh, I shouldn't feel this way in all these ways.
Right. I mean, all emotions has their function.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
That's how we connect with each other.
Yes. Yeah. And I think introducing, patients and clients to the fact that, like, there's those signals, as you mentioned, and it helps us to connect. It's like a whole different level of not having to shut down, but actually having to understand, what does this mean about this relationship? And, what does this mean about maybe something I need to communicate? First of all, just really normalizing the fact that, like, this is something that a lot of men and boys experience is feeling like, you know, it's kind of not okay to get help, and that this is something that not only they experience, and just kind of like in a simple way, just really normalizing it. I think that can be helpful, but along with that, really, you know, giving praise, giving acknowledgement to the courage that it takes, you know, to really sort of be honest with about things that are hard, and not doing it in a way that's sort of over the top. I think that sometimes I've maybe, when I was especially an early therapist, I think that I could sort of use that in a way that might feel like, you know, someone's like, well, it's not that, you know, it's not that big of a deal that I'm coming in, but just really highlighting it, and even if I don't talk about it too much, really within myself as a therapist, knowing that this is taking courage. And so I might not even name it, but I'm really approaching this person who I'm sitting across, knowing that they've braved sort of a big taboo, a big stigma, you know, to really be there. And I think meeting them where they're at, and I think as a loved one, kind of circling back to what you were talking about, as a loved one, not putting too much pressure, but just really listening and providing. You don't need to fix, you know, your loved one. That's not your responsibility, but really just being a supportive ear, and, you know, continuing at times to just talk to them about the options that are out there. And if they're not into therapy, what are some other things that you know, can really start to provide some connection? Because I think that a big issue when I see men entering therapy and boys is that there's been isolation. You know, there hasn't been connection. So it might be joining, you know, like a group, a men's group. It could be even just calling a friend. And, you know, especially for older men, I think that often when they start to have families, I've noticed that they feel that they can't call their friends, and that they're sort of a burden. So really encouraging that connection, I think, can really open things up.
Yeah, and I really enjoy that connection piece. Just remembering or grounding yourself that like, you're just a human. Right? You can be a very proud man, but at the end of the day, you're just a human.
Yes.
Right?
Yes, and it's okay.
Is no less than, you know, other person. Yes,
it's okay. Your humanity is, you know, it's beautiful. You know, it's something that is, you are okay who you are. You know, and I know that it's really cliched, but I think that that's such a difficult thing to, you know, for us to kind of be in touch with.
So how do men seek help? Let's say if they're like, wow, that sounds awesome. I really want to explore this area of my life and connect, you know, where do they start? How many male therapists are there?
Yeah. I don't know.
Do they need to see a male therapist to understand what they're going through?
So from my perspective, I don't think that that you need to see a male identified therapist. I think that if you want to, I think that there are a lot of male therapists, you know, out there. And I know that there is a conception, and I'm not even sure of the statistics, that there is much fewer sort of male identified therapists. I know that in my kind of, you know, sort of as a client and also as a therapist, I've really been able to see that there's a lot of male therapists. I would say that I think that it really depends on your own, you know, sort of like just kind of trying it out, you know. And so if you kind of start off with a male identified therapist, seeing how that goes, like as with any therapist. And I know that you put out a video, I think you did, about sort of how do I, you know, like kind of finding the right therapist. And so I think just in the same sort of way, just sort of seeing, you know, like, am I able to connect with this therapist? Does this feel that I'm actually able to talk about the, you know, and if we're talking about sort of men's issues, can I talk about things that are really sort of important for me to talk about? So, and it might be with a therapist who's who's female identified, and I think you just kind of need to give it a try and sort of see how it goes.
Right. So it's more about the space that the therapist hold than the gender identification of the.
I think so. Yeah. Those are the ways that I think. But I also really respect, I guess, as a male therapist and as a white male therapist, I really respect that not every patient or client will feel safe or as comfortable coming to speak with me. And I really ask right away in the first session, and just kind of make it an explicit thing. I would encourage that if your therapist does not bring that up, if you try it out with a therapist, to really sort of bring up your concerns. Because I think that you might have some discomfort, but if you notice that speaking with a therapist, that you're able to really feel heard, that could really help with some of those, maybe with like the issues that you're coming in with, to be able to speak about them. So I would just really encourage anyone who's watching this video that there is and there are safe spaces in therapy. There is the right fit out there, and to keep really trying if you haven't found that fit yet.
Yeah. As I stated on the other video that I have, right? A lot of therapists offer a free consultation.
Yes.
Not long, 10 to 15 minutes. So if it's awkward, he ends there, right?
Yeah.
But those kind of 10, 15 minutes will allow you to figure out if this therapist is a good fit.
Yeah. Yes.
Right? Because you are being very vulnerable in this space, and a lot of us, hopefully you're finding it online from a, credited source that you're seeking someone that's licensed. That's very important. When it comes to kind of competence and ethical practice.
Yeah, definitely. I just want to thank you again for letting me be on the Millennial Psychologist channel. This has been awesome.
Of course, very nice having you today. Thank you.
So that's it from me and Dr. Griffin. If you have any questions about the topic today, feel free to leave a comment below so we can all learn together. Thank you so much for watching. Take care.